Today we're going to be talking about biological pyramids. And essentially these are pyramids that we use to represent any number of things that we see in an ecosystem. We can represent in a pyramid, we can look at the number of individuals that would appear in each trophic level. We can look at the biomass of each trophic level, or we can even look at the energy level within each trophic level. So we're going to kind of break those two, their biomass and energy. We're going to look at those and how they break down for pretty much any ecosystem. They're always going to be stacked the same way, just based on the number of individuals or whatever the case may be. We're going to see a pattern develop there with these pyramids, and like I said, we can apply that to any ecosystem on the planet. So before we begin, I want to talk about just a little bit about biomass and about energy and matter. So the amount of energy and matter, like I said, we can put those into a pyramid, and that pyramid is going to give us a really good visual representation of where either the energy or the biomass is most abundant and least abundant. Okay, so when we're talking about biomass, as the, if we look at that word biomass, okay, and we're familiar with the term mass, right? That's what something weighs. It has mass. And bio is a prefix that we've defined before. That means life. So we're basically talking about life mass. And so it is the amount of living tissue, or the amount, like if we were to weigh all of a certain group of organisms in a given area, or perhaps a volume. So for example, we could say, what is the biomass of fir trees in this acre? Okay. Or we could put it in terms of, what is the amount of producers in 1 cubic meter of this section of the tropical rainforest? And if we were to compare the amount of biomass of producers in a tropical rainforest, we would expect to find a lot more living material in that cubic meter than we would, say, compared to somewhere in the tundra, right, where there's not nearly as much resources, and so therefore we wouldn't expect to find nearly as many producers living in that area. So when we draw the pyramids, whether we're drawing energy or biomass, and I'll kind of show you the comparison between the two, they're going to look the same. Okay, we're going to have just a triangle. We're not going to try to draw it in 3D or anything like that, like an actual pyramid. We're just going to draw a triangle. And what we're going to do, whether we're looking at biomass or whether we're looking at energy available, is we're just going to kind of divvy up this triangle into sections. Okay. Now, depending on the environment, depending on the ecosystem, some may have more levels than others. For example, this pyramid here, we're going to say that this is biomass. This is a biomass period. So this is the amount of organisms we would expect to find at each trophic level. And with any ecosystem, we always know the base trophic level, the base of our pyramid is always going to be the producers. Okay? Producers are always going to be at the bottom. They're going to far outnumber all of the other groups combined. Right, so all the levels above the producers, they're there, but what we're saying is, if we were to look around and say, let's grab a little section of this forest and weigh all the producers in it, those producers are going to outweigh the herbivores, right? And you may say, well, what, I don't know, large animals really weigh a lot, and they do, but you don't find, a large herbivore. They're not stacked, next to each other. They're not just lined up next to each other where we could grab one every cubic meter that we were measuring. Producers, on the other hand, we've got them growing in trees and shrubs and on the ground as grasses. Producers are everywhere. So moving up, our next level would be the herbivores. So these are our plant eaters, and they are feeding on the producers. And again, it makes sense that, the organisms, there has to be more producers than herbivores to make sure that the herbivores do not run out of food. Next up on our list would be, we'll put these kind of in the same group, the carnivores and also the omnivores. Okay. and they would move up. Now, if we wanted to get even more particular, we could break this down. We can break this down at almost any level, right? We could look at individual organisms, and I could say, you know, grass goes here at the bottom. Let's just go ahead and do that. We'll just break it down by an organism, and that way we can use this for our energy pyramid. Now, what I was saying before, I said depending on the type of ecosystem, you may have more levels than others. So what I meant by that was, if I was drawing this for a tropical rainforest, I could have, you know, I may have 7 or perhaps even 8 different trophic levels. If I were drawing the same thing for an area like desert, I probably wouldn't have nearly as many, because I don't have nearly as many producers to choose from, and I may only have one organism, and the top of the pyramid may stop way shorter than it would in a tropical rainforest, right? Because in a tropical rainforest, we simply have more organisms, we have more links in our food chain, and that's kind of what we're representing here. So let's start here. We'll start with some grass. And we'll say that that grass is eaten by a grasshopper. And we'll say that that grasshopper is then eaten by a mouse. And that mouse is eaten by a snake. And then the snake is eaten by a hawk. Okay? And so we have a nice little pyramid here showing this would be a producer, a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, and these guys up here would be, you know, your tertiary consumers, your top level consumer being the hawk, meaning that nothing eats the hawk, right? So this kind of just shows the distribution. And if you were to look at these numbers, you would also see, if we're going back to biomass, that there is more grass than there are grasshoppers, and there are more grasshoppers than there are mice, and there are more mice than there are snakes, and there are more snakes than there are hawks. But the same would also be true if we were talking about energy. And what we mean by energy is we're talking about the energy that is available to each one of these trophic levels, okay? So there's a lot of energy available to the producer level, okay? Because their energy comes directly from the sun. Imagine that's a sun. So that's the sun. And these individuals here, they're gonna receive 100% of the energy from the sun, right? Because they're photosynthetic, they're taking in all of the light from the sun, and they're using that to produce new leaves, new structures, to repair old structures, all that kind of stuff. The problem, though, is when you start to look at this in a little more detail, these guys are using up energy, as I mentioned, for reproduction, for new features, for new structures, for repair, all of that kind of stuff. They are going to use up about 90% of the energy that they get from the sun. So what that means is this next level up is only going to get about 10% of the original energy that was available to this level, to the level that came before it. And that's something we call the 10% rule. Okay? The 10% rule basically says that only about 10% of the energy available at one trophic level is transferred to an organism in the level above it. Okay? So if we continue to move up, then the grasshopper got 10% of the original energy, the mouse would get 1%, the snake would get 0.1%, and this hawk sitting up here by at the top, it would get 0.01% of the original energy that was available at the start of this food chain, okay, at the start of all this energy transfer. Most of this energy is going to be lost as heat, okay? Now, what we mean by that is it's being used by these organisms, right? But even you and I, standing here, we're losing heat. We are radiating heat out of our bodies. All the things that are happening inside of our body, all the chemical reactions that are taking place, all of the processes that are going on, that generates a small amount of heat, okay? And so as these organisms carry out their daily activities, they are losing energy, okay? And there's less energy available to them. So if I am a hawk, I'm thinking, man, it is very good to be at the top of the food chain. I don't have to worry about anything eating me. The only problem for this hawk is if this hawk only feeds on snakes, okay, he is getting a very small amount of energy in each one of those meals. So if I'm a hawk, I'm constantly flying around trying to find food. because the food that I'm eating doesn't have a lot of energy left. It doesn't have a lot of calories in it because all the calories were already consumed by these levels below it. Okay, so luckily for the hawk, it doesn't have to eat just snakes. It could come down here to this level and it could eat mice, or it could eat rabbits, or it could eat squirrels, or those types of things. So it could eat from a different level. But if it were put into a position where those organisms were somehow not available, or that was too scarce in number, or whatever the case may be, now this hawk's in serious jeopardy because, snakes, one, are probably much harder to find, and they have limited amount of energy to give to that hawk. So that's where the 10% rule comes into effect. It also, when going back to where I talked about trophic levels in ecosystems where there's a lot more trophic levels there. If we went to one that had 7 or 8, now we're getting into values like 0.0001, right? So it would be really difficult to sustain yourself as a top predator if you were only eating from that level. So a lot of those top predators are able to eat from this herbivore level, which gives them sufficient energy. For example, you couldn't have in an environment where a lion was, at the, let's say, the 7th trophic level and eating only organisms from the 6th trophic level, because it's not going to be enough food. That lion's going to have to come all the way down here to those primary consumers, and that's what it feeds on, right? Lions are feeding on zebras and those types of grazing animals to get the energy that it needs, because if it were to feed just underneath itself, it's never going to have enough to power an organism of that size. So the 10% rule really ties well into these ecological pyramids, into this energy pyramid, because it's a clear demonstration of as you move up through the trophic levels, that energy just disappears. So the energy is being used by those organisms. It's being released as heat back into the environment. Once it's lost as heat, it's gone. There's no organism out there that's absorbing the heat and saying, oh, look at all this energy that I have, right? They can't do that. It's simply just ambient heat now. It's become part of the atmosphere. Some of it will be lost into space. Some of it will come back to the earth and kind of helps keep the earth warm. But like I said, there's not an organism out there that can just suck up that heat energy and use it. So in addition to energy, as we're moving up this food chain, that's something else that's happening and it's really important to all ecosystems, is nutrients. So if this, this grass is being eaten by this grasshopper is being eaten by this mouse, all of these organisms, as they're consuming other organisms, they are leaving behind waste materials. Those waste materials are being recycled and they're being put back into the environment. So decomposers are doing their job of breaking down organic material, and it's coming right back around to the producers. Right? So then they're able to grow, because without the, even though these organisms are being removed, they're not being completely removed until the decomposers do their job. So when the decomposers come along, they're going to get all those and break all those materials down back into raw materials, which are then reabsorbed by the producers. And it keeps this whole thing going, because if we don't supply the nutrients to keep these producers going, this is another thing, with these pyramids. If something happens, let's say all the decomposers, there's some type of virus among the decomposing bacteria, right? And all the decomposers suddenly they lose the ability to decompose, or they disappear. They all die off. Well, quickly, you're going to see the removal of the producer group, okay? Once the producer is gone, this pyramid tumbles, it collapses. And that also means the ecosystem itself would collapse, because now there's nothing to get this energy from. And you might make the argument, well, mice could still eat grasshoppers and snake could still eat mice. That's right. But when all the grasshoppers and other organisms run out of food because all the grass has died off from lack of nutrients, then all these other groups are going to die off too. So that's the great thing about this pyramid, is it really shows this, the interconnectedness and the interdependence that all of these organisms have on one another. Because without the, the levels above and below them, you don't have a functional pyramid and you don't have a functional ecosystem.